Hi, welcome again to Videos from the Ville. I'm Professor Charles Greenewalt, and this is City Planning. Today we want to talk about historic preservation. So let's take a look at historic preservation, what it is and how it works. Historic preservation is nothing more than the process of keeping older buildings intact. The process of keeping older buildings intact. And I want you to closely, please follow the PowerPoint presentation along with this presentation. You find that in that first slide we have a picture, the very first slide in the introduction was the old Customs building in New York City by the Battery, which has been bought by the Smithsonian, and it's now the Museum of the American Indian. It covers everything from Native Americans from Canada and the Arctic all the way to Tierra del Fuego and the tip of South America. They've done a wonderful job with it. I recommend that you see that if you're in New York and have seen the other sites that you wanted to. But let's look at historic preservation, the process of keeping older buildings intact. This first slide is Wheatland, of course, here in Lancaster, the house of former President James Buchanan, which is nicely restored and run. Well, there's different types of preservation, and we have on this next slide a listing of 5 different types of preservation. First, we have restorative. Restorative preservation is trying to return the property to the original condition that it was in. When Montpelier in Orange, Virginia, was given over to the National Historic Trust, they had to determine when to return the condition of Montpelier to. Of course, it was James Madison's house. It had been owned for generations by the DuPont family and had been taken very good care of, but it had been changed and added to over the years. They decided to restore it to the very condition that it was in when James Madison lived there. So restorative is one type of preservation. A second type of preservation is to rehabilitate it and to renovate it. Rehabilitate it and renovate it. And this simply involves what are the strategies that we can use to make deteriorating buildings whole again. A third strategy, type of preservation, is conservation. And when we engage in conservation, we're simply trying to preserve what exists now, and to direct change in the future. The fourth type of preservation is replication or imitation. Here, this is done in towns of symbolic importance, in tourist cities, in cities that may have experienced heavy wartime destruction, replication or imitation. And finally, the fifth type of preservation is simply relocation. And this is moving buildings from one location to another. We have this in Charlottesville. When you go to see Monticello and you drive up the mountain, about 3/4 of the way up the mountain, there is Mickey's Tavern, M-I-C-H-I-E, Mickey's Tavern. Wonderful place to take a look at. And right by Mickey's Tavern is a mill. There's been a mill that's been placed there. That was relocated. From another part of Albemarle County to the site of Mickey's Tavern shortly after I left Charlottesville in 1985. Okay, so that's another type of preservation. There are different scales of preservation action. There's one would be natural areas, and the slide that I have in your PowerPoints shows a natural area of Death Valley. We can preserve areas. In this instance, we're trying to preserve Death Valley, or another one might be the Badlands, for example, in South Dakota. You can try to preserve towns and villages. Here in this instance, there's a picture of Ocean Grove, New Jersey. You can try to preserve towns and villages, such as perhaps Lewis, Delaware, or we find Bar Harbor, Maine, for example. And we have skylines. We can try to preserve skylines, and of course one of the most famous skylines, and the one I have in the PowerPoint, is of course the skyline of Paris. No buildings are allowed to rival or come close to the Eiffel Tower in height. So all the large buildings in Paris are on the outskirts or out of town, but nothing rivals the Eiffel Tower, and the skyline of Paris remains very beautiful. Another scale of preservation action are districts that can be preserved. Here in the PowerPoint I have Overlook Farms in Philadelphia. This is a district. Districts, as I say on the PowerPoint, are pockets of the past. Districts are pockets of the past that still remain. They have a physical coherence to them. They have strong edges that create a sense of identity within them as well. The German village in Columbus, Ohio would be another district, for example. Then we have another scale of preservation action would be a neighborhood. A neighborhood would protect a lifestyle and a particular socioeconomic profile in one area or another. So neighborhoods would protect a lifestyle or a particular socioeconomic profile. Here I show you some neighborhoods, for example, in your PowerPoints on Albany, New York, Cobbs Creek in Philadelphia. I show you Southside Philadelphia, and I show you the Lower Heights District in San Francisco as examples of neighborhood preservation. Another scale of preservation action could be streetscapes. Here is a bit of Madison Square Plaza in New York City, streetscapes. And I show you also Octavia Boulevard in San Francisco. Lastly, well, not lastly, but another scale of preservation action would be buildings. And some of the buildings that I have here that have been preserved and I shared on the PowerPoint would be Falling Water. Of course, Frank Lloyd Wright's famous house out near Seven Springs in western Pennsylvania. We also have Frauncis's Tavern in New York City, which is very much alive and well. This is where George Washington bade farewell to his officers after the end of the Revolutionary War. You find that this is one of the most famous taverns and restaurants in America. This is where you wanted to be to see and be seen during the Revolutionary War. If you're on the American side, at least while the Americans occupied New York City, you'll find that today there's still a very active restaurant and tavern, fantastic one on the first floor. The upper three floors are all a museum dedicated to the Revolutionary War, and one of the best ones in America. This is south of Wall Street, and it's on the way to the Battery. Frauncis's Tavern is where the Magna Carta was shown when it came to the United States several years ago. It's a must-see for anyone interested in early American history, but yet it's not as well known as it should be. You have the Roman Colosseum there as a building that's been preserved. When I first went to the Colosseum in 1980, it was quite a wreck. And I went back in 2002. The government, slowly but surely, the Italian government has been restoring it and rebuilding it in a historically accurate way. So that's an interesting transformation. And lastly, of the cloisters from Ephrata that are not too far from here and very well preserved. Have a great history. Lastly, scales of preservation action. We have fragments of scales of preservation action. We have fragments and objects. Fragments and objects. Here I have the great Coca-Cola sign at Fenway Park. When Fenway Park was rebuilt, that was supposed to come down, and the fans in the city reacted against it, and they saved the Coca-Cola sign. They like it too much. You also have the Liberty Bell in the other corner in Philadelphia. Of course, has its own little building in front of Independence Hall. And then here we have two other fragments from Roanoke, Virginia. One is the Roanoke Star, which is on top of the mountain overlooking Roanoke. It's enormous and has been there for many, many years. And then the other one is the H&C neon coffee sign in Roanoke. You see this on the interstate as you go past downtown Roanoke. It has been working for many, many years. You will see the lights come on and the pot of coffee will come out. It will tilt itself. It will pour coffee into the cup, and the whole thing is done through neon lights. You can watch the whole process on YouTube. You can see that light in action. If we were in the traditional classroom setting, I would show it to you. I have that to take a look at. Well, what are the motives for preservation? The motives for preservation are what? Well, to protect our legacy, to ensure variety in the urban fabric, right? A motive for preservation is economic. Many tourists want to see these preserved buildings, and that will help the economy of the area. And motives for preservation are symbolic as well. Again, you can go back to the Liberty Bell to preserve that, or Francis's Tavern. It's a great source of patriotism and very rich symbol of American history. The methods of preservation are very diverse. We have the legal methods on preservation are lists of historic buildings and areas, such as the National Register of Historic Places. We have zoning, we have variances, we have easements and deed restrictions, we have demolition control, and we have design guidelines. These are all legal methods to preserve one part or another of the urban fabric. Economic methods to preserve our historic structures are grants that can be acquired, revolving funds that might be available to us to use the money to buy the structure or to preserve it. We can give those structures tax incentives to stay and to rebuild. We can do a development rights transfer. The area can sell its rights to develop, and then it must be preserved as it is for perpetuity. So development rights transfer, and then penalties as well. As well. These are all economic methods to help preserve historic artifacts. Well, what are the problems of preservation? The problems of preservation are all spelled out here in this very chock-full PowerPoint slide. There are 6 preservation problems. First of all, who gets to decide what's preserved? Who gets to decide for how long it's preserved? Do experts in architecture decide this? Experts in history? The owners of the building? Or are we going to let this up to politicians to decide? The second preservation problem is how can we reconcile the preservation of historic structures with other imperatives of the time and of the day, such as the need to make all buildings energy efficient. How can we preserve a historic structure and still put in the things that are required to make it energy efficient? Who pays for preservation? Who profits from preservation is the third problem. The fourth problem is how extensive should restrictions be on changes to the historic buildings? Number 5, what rights do the owners and do the renters have in regard to their tenure in a historic structure? And 6, finally, what rights and responsibilities do other citizens have? Can they force the owners to preserve and care for historic buildings or not? What rights and responsibilities do other citizens have? And this takes us through historic preservation. I hope you look very carefully at the pictures on this presentation and the PowerPoints because that's just as useful as the written material, I believe. So take a look at that, and we'll be back